Hello, my name is Dr. Eric. I'm a psychiatrist who happens to be religious, and I focus on helping high performers maintain a close connection to a higher power. This is Chez Eric PRL, PRL standing for Psychiatry, Religion, and Life. Chez Eric being French for my home, although I'm not French. It's a marketing thing. So today I would like to talk about the Chez Eric process. What is it? Well, I've alluded to it before in previous videos, the Why Psychiatry and Religion video, and the Entrepreneurship video, and the Health, Wealth, and Prosperity video. But I found myself wanting to repeat myself again to people I see in real life and wanting to have a video so I can say it once and send them over to that to really kind of detail what the Chez Eric process is for being a high performer with a close connection to a higher power. And I showed it before, so I'll show it again here. It's really just 5 steps. And the 5 steps are understanding yourself, and then understanding reality, and then making high quality decisions. And then you want to choose your sacrifice, or choose your consequences. And finally, you can choose God, and that's optional. That's totally up to you whether or not you want to do that. In this video, I really want to go very in-depth about the Chez Eric process to help you understand where I'm coming from, and also to, send this video to people so I don't have to repeat myself over and over and over again. Although I don't mind explaining it, but you might as well make a video about it, right? Because it makes a lot of sense. So I hope you enjoy this content. The first part of the Chez Eric process is this idea of understanding yourself. And understanding yourself can be a fairly simple thing in the sense that, you know yourself pretty well, you spend a lot of time with yourself, you should be the person you know the most. On the other hand, it could be a very difficult thing because it takes a whole entire lifetime to understand who you are, and the world has ways of really confusing us about who we actually are and what we actually want out of life. And so it can be very, very complex, and there's a lot of really great material out there to help you understand how to understand yourself. But for our purposes, for the Chez Eric process, I've sort of created this concept of the 5 parts of a person. And I described this over in the Why Psychiatry and Religion, but I want to describe it again and talk about it again because I think it'll be very helpful. And I want to talk about it in the context of the Chez Eric process as opposed to the context of the Why Psychiatry and Religion. So just to recap, the 5 parts of a person is the biological part, the psychological part, the emotional part, the existential part, and the spiritual part. I kind of ripped this off of the biopsychosocial formulation. That's a really big part of mental health diagnoses and processes and helping other people in the mental health space for mental health providers. The biopsychosocial concept is one that we often use to formulate what a patient is going through, because we recognize that there's a biological part to them, there's a psychological part to them, and then there's a social part to them. I took this and I kind of meshed it with concepts that we learned traditionally, let's say from the Bible, where there's a soul involved, and then there's emotions involved, and there's a heart, right, and things like that. As I've thought about it prior to even creating this YouTube channel, I thought to myself, the conflicts that I personally experience and the conflicts that I see other people experience has a tendency to fall within these 5 categories. And what I found is that these 5 categories are sufficient to describe all types of conflict. And I don't really need, more categories than these 5. And I found that going down to 4 doesn't really help it. I was actually debating over whether there's a difference between the existential and the spiritual, but we'll get to that later. But I found that by understanding these 5 parts, I was able then to recognize conflict a lot better and understand the nature of the conflict. And more importantly, because I was able to understand the nature of the conflict, I was able to find solutions a lot better. So for example, if there's really an emotional issue, then there's no reason to use a biological solution in the form of, let's say, eating for comfort or drugs or other things like that, because it'll create this weird feedback loop where you're not getting the real thing solved. And then it works with all the different, so if there's a biological problem, it doesn't help to appease your emotions if you're feeling anxious about it, because, you really need to focus on that biological issue. And there are other conflicts as well, just that biology and emotional things are often the most common conflict that we can very clearly recognize. So the 5 parts of a person, they actually all have very specific definitions and very specific concepts and how they all interact with each other. So I'll start. right? With the biological, this should be fairly straightforward. And I usually go by this really quickly saying it's your biological self. It's the part of you that breathes, that has a heart rate, that has a whole bunch of things in your body with the blood cells and pumping blood or everything, and your brain doing its stuff as well. This is where medicine really focuses on trying to help you, your biological self. If you have a broken arm, we fix it, right? If you have a broken leg, we fix it. If you have an infection, we fix it. We try to, at least, right? So the biological self, that is what we have. And everything else actually is founded on the biological self. Everything else is put inside the biological self, and we express ourselves through the biological self. So we can't really ignore it. What I find most often is that people do ignore it. They ignore the biological self because it is kind of a thing that you just live in and you deal with, and maybe you pay attention to it, maybe you don't, but there are often other things that are more important than your sleep, more important than your nutrition, more important than your exercise, right? All these things are more important, and a lot of people don't have the luxury. It's a luxury to care about your body, to be good to your body. And this makes a lot of sense. I mean, a lot of people don't have the hours in the day to do a run, right? Or people don't have the luxury to not sit all day long in their office. We are asked to do things and stretch our bodies to certain limits because our current state of society doesn't really value the physical labor that people can do. They value more intellectual labors because we do have a fairly advanced society. But it doesn't mean that we can ignore our body. And when it comes to this idea of a high performer, it would be very challenging for you to compete in the most competitive sport called the free market if the very thing that houses every other aspect of yourself, your mind, your emotions, the existential part of you, the spiritual part of you, if all of that is housed on a body that isn't sleeping right or isn't eating well or has lots of inflammation and constantly distracting you, it's going to be very, very challenging for you to go through, competing against somebody else who does have those biological issues all figured out. So that's the biology, and that's how it fits in the larger framework. The second thing would be the psychology. And the psychology of someone is what I would call, someone's mind, right? But then psychology interacts with biology in a particular way, where if your mind isn't right, then you're not going to think right, but then how do you tell the difference between the two? So, although there's a little bit of blurring, I want to define, psychology very specifically as everything that, we talk about with psychoanalysis, things we talk about with Freud, with the id, ego, and superego, everything we talk about with defense mechanisms, everything we talk about with, cognitive biases, everything we talk about, with many different biases that we personally have, everything we talk about our interactions with our past that, reflects in our decision-making today that might be considered irrational, and even, your logical thought processes and your logical thinking, and your IQ and your personality, all that stuff is the psychological. And you can imagine that psychology is fairly important. You can also imagine that psychology has a way of really messing you up sometimes, making you do things you didn't want to do, hiding things from yourself that you didn't realize. And that's where the entirety of psychiatry and psychology and all that stuff tries to help you get yourself to be better. If you're in a negative space and you're so depressed or anxious or something to that extent, it can potentially help you get to a more neutral space, but it won't get you beyond that. It won't get you to create meaning and fulfillment, because psychology is really meant to understand yourself and how we live in this world and how we perceive this world. And it's a very, very important aspect of understanding yourself. The next one is emotional. That's the emotional part of us, number 3. And the emotional part of us, one might think, what's the difference? Isn't psychology just emotion, or what are emotions? It's fairly simple. The reason why I separate psychology and emotions, even though technically speaking all emotions come from your brain, right, is because I really want to separate emotions as a distinct entity, because it seems to conflict with a lot of our better rationale, better reasoning, or even with our biology, or even with everything else. Our emotions seem to exist on their own plane, and we can choose to follow them. We can choose to get rid of them or quash them away, or we can choose to process them. Obviously, I am more partial to the processing technique, but other people might want to do the others, which I don't highly recommend, but there's a time for some of them sometimes. So what are emotions and why are they important? Well, a lot of the time we say, yeah, they're important, but we don't actually take the time to process them, to understand them. We don't actually take the time to really understand what they're trying to do. And I think that's because we don't have a very strong definition of what an emotion is. I've talked about this before, but I'll say it again. In my view, the way I'm defining it here for the Chez Eric process, emotions are things that close the gap between what you know and what you don't know. They close the gap between what you know and what you don't know to improve your survival. And the common example I have is fear. If you are if you see a rustling in the bush, right, it could be a tiger, and you don't know whether or not it's a tiger. So your emotion is fear to cause you to run away so you can survive to live another day. If you're in the middle of the city, well, that's not really going to help you all that much, but you still are going to run away in fear. And if you are in the jungle, it would be much more useful. So this idea of an emotion that makes you do something related to an unknown to help with your survival, that is at the core of what an emotion is. Now, if we look at other emotions, like happiness, it's not as obvious, but in some respects it can work because you have an event that's happening and you don't exactly know why it's a good event, so you just naturally and instinctually become happy. And with sadness, you know something is wrong. You don't exactly know what it is, but you just know that something's wrong, so it forces you to dig deeper. And when you dig deeper, you can then discover what's making you sad and potentially fix the issue. And if you can't fix the issue, that causes anxiety, and that's where you get into these weird loops, right? But it's all supposed to be made for your survival or for the survival of something greater. And that's what emotions do. They kind of close the gap between what you know and what you don't know to make you do an action. That's where I usually leave off, but I'm going to add more to it now because this is the space for it. When it comes to processing the emotion, when it comes to becoming a high performer with a close connection to a higher power, you're going to have emotions. And the temptation will be to get rid of them or to push them away. There really isn't a lot to really formulate how to process them outside of a therapy setting. You go to therapy, you talk about how to process your emotions, and you feel better. But outside of that, maybe you have to read a million books on therapy to be able to process it on your own. It's kind of like doing a surgery on yourself, but not exactly. But you can imagine how it's challenging in a video setting, in a textbook setting, to explain to people how to process your emotions. The way I can best describe how to process your emotions is this idea of recognizing that emotions, by definition, always point to something true about yourself. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you take the emotion as it is, and if you don't try to wish it away, if you don't try to push it away, if you don't try to shame it, if you don't try to say it's a bad emotion, if you don't try to say, negative things about it, then what ends up happening is that you take it as it is, and you need to begin to discover what that emotion is pointing to. So for example, if you are very, very angry about an injustice in the world, you might find that the emotion is pointing towards your great desire for justice and your passion for justice. There's a lot of unjust things happening out there, right? And so when you get incredibly angry, right, it's closing the gap between what you know and what you don't know, right, to cause you to want to do something because it's for your survival. Because if we have an unjust world, our survival individually and as a society is not going to be very great. By identifying the emotion, let's say even of sadness, right, of extreme sadness, well, that would be pointing to something that you really care about, something that you really want. And when you take the time to figure out that that's what you really want, you realize that that's a really core part of who you are. So therefore, understanding your emotions and understanding that it's actually always true. Your emotion is always true. It might not make you do the right thing. It might be leading you towards the wrong direction if you act on it. But the emotion that you have, the emotions you have will always point to a fundamental truth. And often at times when people have emotions that are disturbing, it's in conflict with the other parts of who you are, the biological, the psychological, the existential, and the spiritual. And it would be important to identify that at the core of who you are, there's a conflict between the others. And then resolving that conflict of why, you at least solve the problem. And when you figured out what the problem is, you've diagnosed the problem, then you can begin to solve it. So that's, in a nutshell, how I would explain this process of processing your emotions. With the fourth thing, we start getting into this space of growth, where we talk about the existential and the spiritual. And for the first three, that's where we got the biopsychosocial formulation. So with the traditional biopsychosocial formulation, I'm talking about biology, I'm talking about psychology, but I kind of put social away, but I'm going to bring it back. But I'll show you later. And for those who understand my content, they know where I'm going to bring it back. But I'll bring it back. But for now, the first three is really, really good when we're talking about psychiatry. Because psychiatry is very, very good at understanding these concepts of your biology and these concepts of your psychology. However, it's not that great when it's asking you what is the meaning of life, when the question fundamentally is, about your purpose and fulfillment. They just say, yeah, you'll figure it out, right? And they don't have really processes to figure it out, which is why we have a huge dynamic of self-help stuff, helping people figure out their purpose and meaning. The unfortunate part about the self-help stuff is that people don't recognize that they got to figure out the negative aspects of themselves before they can really get into the existential and spiritual aspects. They want to go into the fulfillment, but then they're not even sleeping 8 hours a day, right? So it's really, or they're not even eating well enough, or they're not even processing their emotions well enough. They want to feel like that they have a purpose, but they haven't figured out the biological, psychological, and the emotional aspects of themselves with absolute and pure clarity. But now we come into the existential and spiritual parts, and I originally had my mind thinking that they're the same, right? That they didn't need two. But then I had a conversation with some church friends of mine, and they said, oh, the Bible said that the spiritual and the soul are two different things. And I thought to myself, and I reflected on it, and I realized that there were moments in my life where I had my biology fine, my psychology was fine, my emotions were fine, but there was something off. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that there was this disconnect between my connection to a higher power and myself and what I wanted to do. And then the story of, was it Jonas with the whale is a good example of that. He didn't want to go to the place to preach about God. He just wanted to chill at his place before because it was really cool. And then that was the conflict between what he wanted to do versus what a higher power wanted to do. Although, don't follow his example, he didn't really come out the hero at the end. It was more an example of how God will make you do what he needs you to do, whether you like it or not. But that's a story for another day. That's actually possibly even another channel. But anyway, so what is existential as opposed to spiritual? I've talked about this in previous videos, but now I can talk about it a little bit more. The existential part of you is the part of you that always wants to grow. And that is something that I find to be distinctly human. And the example I usually give is that if there's a cat that has food and shelter for the rest of its life, it'll be pretty satisfied. It'll be pretty happy. I mean, it won't really ask for more. If you give a human food and shelter for the rest of its life, then what will end up happening is that, the human will want more. If you give a human, $1 million, the human will want two. You give him two, want four, and always grow. And for some strange reason, people, humans, want to grow. Now you might be saying to yourself, I know a lot of people don't want to grow. I know a lot of people who just want to sit down and do nothing with their lives. That's possible, I could be wrong, but I do find that the large majority of at least young people, right, want to grow. And not that young people, not that old people don't want to grow. I interpret the existence of people not wanting to grow as their decision to handle this issue of growth. My premise is that everybody wants to grow, and the underlying reason is because I believe that everybody wants to grow towards God. That's a subconscious thing that God put into us, but that's a different story, a different thing to talk about, but that's my reason, right? And because everybody wants to grow, then we have two choices. We can either feed that growth or we can quash the growth. And some people choose to quash the growth because the desire for growth is so painful. The desire to want to do more is so painful. They don't believe in themselves and they don't think they can do it, or society is really bad, that they decide that it's better to ignore it. They decide to watch a lot of TV. They decide to just have a lot of really bad habits. They decide to not grow. And that's where they begin to build this mentality of just survival and safety. And that's where it's almost like they're behaving more like, I don't want to be derogatory, they're behaving more like an animal, right? Where it's just about survival and it's just about their safety. And then when bad things happen, they don't want to grow, and therefore it's this weird situation. And the truth is that if you want to be a high performer, you're going to have to want to grow. And if you want to be one that connects to a higher power, well, that growth needs to be towards that higher power. So I personally believe that everybody wants to grow. I could be wrong. You can prove me wrong. And my theory is that we either fulfill that growth or we don't. And, if we choose not to, then it's a different sort of psychology and mindset. But if we do, right, if we want that and it's not fulfilled, that's where we feel this existential dread. That's where we feel really bad. That's where we feel like life isn't worth living. That's where we feel really awkward and something's wrong, and we have this malaise, even though we have every other aspect of our lives perfectly fine. Biologically, we're fine. Psychologically, we're fine, right? Emotionally, we're fine, except something's a little bit off. And whenever I have patients or clients or even friends and family, and I ask them where are they growing, oftentimes they don't know. Oftentimes that question isn't being answered, and when I work with them on figuring out a space where they're going to grow, they feel a ton better, a lot better. And so to be a high performer with a close connection to higher power, you need the first three. And once you get the first three, the biological, psychological, and emotional, then you can begin to ask yourself, where do you want to grow in your life? Where do you fundamentally, as an individual, want to grow? And that would be the existential part of you. And if you don't satisfy it, that's fine. But there are consequences to trying to quash it and close it off. It's almost as if you give up your humanity when you give away your desire for growth. Finally, the last part, the fifth part, the spiritual aspect of somebody is what, a lot of people would think, okay, it's your connection with God. But I'm actually going to take a very, very different approach to this. And if you watch my other materials, you know the direction I'm going. I'm going to say that the spiritual parts of a person is actually their understanding of where they fit in the world. Religion has a huge tapestry of asking us how we fit in the world, and is traditionally in the context of loving other people. But loving other people is very vague. And so on a spiritual level, you have to understand where your skill set is and what you want to do and where you feel the most fulfilled in helping the world, in helping the larger society. And this is where the biopsychosocial formulation, I left out the social, this is where the social aspects come later. And you might be saying to yourself, oh, that means you're worshiping the world. You're a horrible person, Dr. Eric, because you're clearly world worshiping. You're not God worshiping. Whatever. Okay. It's not so much that you need God to answer this question. It's not so much that you don't even need God to answer this question. It's not so much that spirituality is related to the world. It's this connection that you exist, but you don't exist in isolation. And because we as human beings are social creatures, we exist within a social framework and we have a place in this social framework. Religion has the construct to describe our place in the social framework and give us answers to that, or at least answers that we can adopt to help us live more fulfilling lives. But if you don't want to adopt any religion or belief in God or a following God, you can theoretically replace it with a very highly constructed worldview, because you're going to have to kind of start from scratch, right? A highly constructed worldview of how you want to better the human species. And if you don't want to benefit the human species, then what will end up happening is that you don't have a spiritual side of you that wants to interact with the rest of the world. You just want to live in a cave and do your own thing, and you will end up, by definition, dying old and alone, theoretically, right? That's how it goes. And so I recognize that this idea of spirituality, that this feeling that we have with spirituality really is more about our connection with the world. And for a lot of people, they want to connect with the world through a higher power. But with other people, they prefer to connect with the world in a different way. And they, I would say, actually feel very fulfilled. They feel very, very, very fulfilled. I would argue that, belief in higher power would help them more, blah, blah, blah. That's a discussion for another day. But just to highlight that is what I'm defining spirituality is. It's this idea of understanding fully your connection to the larger society and where you fit. And traditionally, it's in the form of how you love others and how others love you. And what I find is that when people are spiritually, not empty per se, but like lost, the first question I have to ask is, who do you love? And who loves you? And what I find is that that's the question they can't answer. Although theoretically, a lot of people can't answer it. So I might be cheating with all my fancy, interesting questions. So that's the 5 parts of a person. And in my view, if you go in this order, biological, psychological, emotional, existential, spiritual, and you take the time to understand yourself in all of these ways in a very objective way, in a very realistic way, then you will then have a very, very strong understanding of yourself to then be able to launch out to the other steps of the Chez Eric process of becoming a high performer with a close connection to a higher power. So we just spoke about the 5 parts of a person. I hope you found that very, very enjoyable. And right now we are going to be talking about the next step, the second step of the Chez Eric process, which is understanding reality. Now, understanding reality might be a given. You might be very good at understanding reality, but the truth is that no, no one is really great at understanding reality. And this is a very, very critical part about the Chez Eric process, or just any process whatsoever that's related to some idea of success. You have to understand reality. And I am sorry to say that a large majority of people in this world are absolutely delusional and absolutely ridiculous and absolutely believe in this toxic positivity, and I really hate it. It's really annoying, and it's about time to understand reality. And understanding reality is not necessarily being cynical and negative also. It's not, I'm a realist. That's not understanding reality either. Because you can be super negative in the opposite direction as well, and it will also distort everything that you're trying to do. So the question is, how do you understand reality? How do you understand, what reality is? What is reality? And let's get it all philosophical, and let's talk a million hours about reality and not get anywhere for any practical purposes, because that's exactly what I like. That's not what I like to do. I don't like to do that, okay? When it comes to reality, we have to recognize the problem of understanding reality for a human being. Human beings, by definition, can only understand the world through their experience. And here's the key part, through their individual experience. This implies that someone halfway across the world will have a very different experience than me over here. And therefore, their understanding of the world will be very different than me over here. If I become very good friends with that person, then our understanding of reality will begin to be colored by reports of other people. And you can understand that understanding reality has a lot to do with collecting information outside of just yourself. But that's very tiring and it's very exhaustive. And a lot of times you don't even care. For example, there's a reality on how high fructose corn syrup is made. I don't need to know it. I don't need to know how my soda is made. I don't need to spend time learning about it. I just want to drink the soda and we're fine. I don't have to understand every single aspect of reality. I theoretically only need to understand the relevant parts of my reality. However, what is relevant, right? What is the reality that we need, and what is the true reality? And what's this issue about, like, I'm going to make my own reality? Don't do that. Don't create your own reality, because there's a reality you discover. I'll get into that later. Okay, you discover reality. Okay, so how am I going to get to this? Okay, it's actually really simple and kind of complex, but really simple, okay? Understanding your reality is realizing that your experience is really founded on this law of induction. Law of induction means that you can induce what the world is about by taking small samples of the world. So for example, let's say you have a big jar of marbles and you take out one marble and the first marble is green. And then you take out another marble and the second marble is green. What are your thoughts about the next marble? Well, you might be thinking, hey, it might be green. And you might be right. And let's say after 1,000 marbles, right, you take it out and they're all green. You're going to say, even though there are a million marbles in here, it's probably all green. Now, this would be very different if you took out marbles and they all were different colors. Then you might have a different view of it. But the truth is that until you take out all 1 million marbles, you don't have any idea. Well, no, sorry. You have an idea of what it is, but you can't say for certain what the box of marbles contains. All green ones versus not green ones or whatever. Okay, you just can't know. It's not possible. So that's what life is. You experience life and you're taking marbles in, although the marbles are far more complex than just green. And you're taking information in, but if you only have your own information, it's like only taking out 10 marbles. But if you get the reports of other people taking out marbles, you got 100 reports of marbles, but then they might be really bad at knowing what colors are, so you might get the wrong things, and it gets really, really confusing. The truth is that your life is not about testing out marbles and whether or not they're green. Your life is not about, figuring out reality and what is true. Your life is about getting things done. So When we do this idea of inductive processing, of figuring out what the marble colors are, or in real life, figuring out what life and reality is about, we're fundamentally going through a scientific method. The scientific method being, you create a hypothesis, then you create an experiment, or you observe something, right? And then you get data collection, you collect the data, and then you analyze the data to potentially refine your original hypothesis, your original theory about the world. And by doing this process over and over and over again for the things that matter to you, you will then be able to get a very good understanding of reality. Sounds simple, right? But for some reason, a lot of people don't do that. And the reason is because it's very challenging to collect data. It's very challenging to analyze data. In fact, there's an entire field called science where we figure out how to appropriately collect data, how to appropriately analyze data, and even the experts disagree on many, many things. Many things. So, that being said, how can this process help you? And do you now all of a sudden have to get a science degree to understand reality? Well, I would say that I hope that basic education teaches you the basic sciences, but unfortunately, basic education has not taught basically anything, because I see a lot of people running around not understanding basic sciences or basic observational skills, not to insult other people, but I am just very frustrated because I wish the basic stuff could be taught so I didn't have to teach it, so I can get on to the more fun things. But it is what it is. And you know what? It's not the educational system's fault. The truth is that we live in a very complex society that can't teach education to everybody equally, and as a result, people are left without too many resources, which is why I love YouTube. Lots of resources here for me to give to people and for me to consume on my own. So how can I go in more in depth about this idea of understanding reality? Well, first is this idea of hypothesis. You want to have a theory about the world, and you want to be very explicit about this theory. You want to be very explicit about what you believe about the world. And with that belief, you want to ask yourself, does it change or does it affect the way you do things? Does it affect your decision-making process? Does it affect your actions? If it doesn't, then why even bother with it? Why even bother holding on to it, right? If I believe that aliens exist, but nothing comes of it, well, what's the point of even going deeper into it? You might do it for entertainment. That's cool, right? But if it doesn't fundamentally change the way you interact with the world, I would say on a practical level, meh, like why even bother? But you know what? You know, some people enjoy it, and if it's enjoyable to talk about this thing that doesn't affect you practically, by all means go do it. But recognize that if it doesn't affect you on any practical level, it is not a scientific endeavor, and it is unlikely to be able to be used to understand reality greater. Because if it doesn't change anything, it doesn't add anything to your life, then it's really a non-thing. And all these words I used is just describing this concept of metaphysics, things that we just can't really test. So this is not, we're not talking about metaphysics here, we're not talking about things we can't test, we're talking about things that we can test and things that we care about. Okay, so you have a theory about the world that matters, all right? The next thing is you have to ask yourself, how can I test whether this theory is correct? You do an experiment, right? And the experiment could be very expensive, it could be very cheap. So for example, let's say I believe that Coca-Cola is sweet. I heard it from somebody else, that it's sweet and it tastes good. Well, the experiment would then be, I should take a bottle of Coca-Cola and should try it. If I'm afraid that it's bad or it's poisonous, the experiment could be, I take a Coca-Cola and I give it to my sister and let her taste it and let me know how it goes, right? But generally speaking, you can imagine that's a very low-cost experiment that I could do on my theory that Coca-Cola is sweet. I hope I don't get copyright protected with saying the word Coca-Cola. YouTube algorithm. Anyway. So that's a cheap experiment, but you can imagine with a cheap experiment, I get very cheap results. All right, cocoa sweet, nice to call it a day, whatever. A more expensive experiment would be, I want to know whether or not a YouTube channel on psychiatry and religion would be popular, if it could be done, if the world would want it. I believe it has value. The world might say, it has no value. I am testing it out. And it's a little more expensive to do all this work, and to do the production and do all the editing and growing and stuff like that. But this is me probing the world to see if the world, is it possible for the world to adopt this idea of psychiatry and religion, and the first target market is high performers who want to maintain a close connection to a higher power. That's really cool, at least in my view. Okay, so I'm testing it out, and I'm seeing that there are certain nuances that I didn't realize, that the reality shows that there is a small space where I can do things, but I have to still see if it works. And I'm learning more and more about reality to then make better decisions about what I do with this channel. Finally, the last example I want to give about understanding reality in this context of experiment is college. All right, college is very expensive. After you graduate from high school, you have to decide whether or not you want to take a lot of debt, and you have to spend 4 years. Medical school is even longer. Another 4 years, but another 8 years, or 3 years, and bajillions of years, 10 years or whatever. That is an experiment that's a decade long and very monetarily expensive. You only get one shot at this experiment. So what do? Well, this is why you rely on other people, you rely on reports, you rely on your parents, you rely on bajillions of other things, because there are some experiments that you can't afford to do more than once. Marriage is another one, right? I mean, people can afford to do it more than once, but people don't want to. So what we have is this range, right? This interesting range of, you have cheap experiments, middle experiments, and really expensive experiments. But when we're trying to understand reality and we have an experiment, then what are we? Well, how can we understand reality if the things that really matter to us cost so much? They're too expensive to run over and over and over again. And that's where we have to rely on other people's reports. That's where we have to rely on observing other people's things to get a better theory, so that when we do create the experiment, it's based on a lot of previous people's information. And when we do the experiment, we can at least do an experiment that has been done before, so we don't have to repeat the mistakes of other people. This is why having a mentor is very good at understanding reality. This is why having, reports and research is very good before you start your business idea. This is why doing research on whether or not you would like medical school or whatever, or law school, just having experience with it would prevent you from making too many expensive experiments and gaining too little understanding of reality as a result of that. But this is the worst part. Let's say you have a series of experiments that you really like and you enjoy, and then you're not spending too much, money and time on it or things like that. And it's not too expensive, and you're enjoying your life doing these experiments and learning more about reality. If you don't collect the data appropriately, meaning that you take the time to reflect on these experiences in a very unbiased way, then everything you experience would be completely off, and you will have changes in your theory that's incorrect over and over again. And if you don't analyze the data correctly after you've gotten, let's say, supposedly good data, well, then you're always going to be refining your theory incorrectly, and that's a bad thing. Because if you have a bad theory of how the world works, then you'll make bad decisions and everything kind of falls apart. That is not the mark of a high performer. So you want to refine it so your theory is good and it's better and it's more refined. But the truth is that there are a lot of components to our psychology, there's a lot of components to our biology, there's a lot of components to our emotions that distorts the data collection process and distorts the data analysis process, such as cognitive biases, such as, mostly cognitive biases, but also defense mechanisms and things like that. Then there are a lot more things like, society telling you things. Some people say the media sucks. I think the media sucks, but whatever, right? Like, if your data collection comes from really bad sources, right? Let's say propaganda sources, then you're going to have a really incorrect view about reality. So what do? Well, that's why I'm talking about reality as a second step, because it's supposed to be founded on the framework of understanding yourself really well. When you understand yourself really well, then you can understand reality a little better. You can interact with the outside world a little bit better, because you are founded and you are the reference point for everything else. And you can critically analyze and challenge things. You can then design experiments to get information. And if you design experiments in your life to get information, you'll always have a higher and more accurate view of the world compared to, let's say, competitors. And that's how you perform higher than you would if you didn't have reality. It sounds basic, it sounds obvious, it sounds easy, which is why I'm not buying a patent on this. This is not something worth patenting. But you can imagine that understanding reality is near impossible to do without a good understanding of yourself. And you can also imagine understanding reality is also very, very challenging. But, you gotta do it, because if you don't, the alternative is to not understand reality, and the alternative is to put a lot of resources in something that is a fundamental delusion. And that is not good. Oh, A note on delusion when it comes to reality, since I believe a lot of people are deluded. The diagnosis of delusion a while ago, I think prior to DSM-3, although that doesn't matter for you, is that delusion used to require for things to be false. However, nowadays we actually don't care about the truth or falsity of a delusion, because a lot of things can still be a delusion, or at least a harm of a delusion can still exist, even though it's not false, even though it can't be proven false. The most harmful thing about a delusion is that it is a fixed idea that does not change to contrary evidence. And the truth is that if you have a fixed idea and you're not able, or if you have any idea and you're not willing to change the idea due to contrary evidence, that is potentially in the delusion space that would severely hurt your functioning. So for example, if I found evidence that the sky is actually purple, because it started being purple, then I'm not going to say the sky is blue and just force it to be blue. That's an easy example. But if, let's say, you're running a business and you believe it's a good idea, but your sales are absolute garbage, but you want to still believe in yourself, you have to face the reality that the sales are garbage and why. And if you have poor analysis or poor data collection, then it's not going to work. And if you get more evidence that it's that it's wrong and you refuse to understand it, I'm sorry, you have a delusion that needs to stop. If your ideas are so fixed that no evidence can change it, then that's a problem. Now you might be saying, Dr. Eric, is God a delusion? Because, clearly people, I can't get into that right now. I will have a very quick statement to simply say, if you understand God through the scientific method, then discovering God can give you a greater reality in God. But that's part of part 5. And that the delusion of God comes when your fixed interpretation of God will not change due to evidence. So if you believe that a particular passage in the Bible tells you to separate the black sheep from the white sheep and that segregation is holy, and no evidence will change your mind, that is a delusion that is actually very, very bad. Not necessarily belief in God. But I'll get to that, we'll talk about it later, okay? Or in another one, because it's a very complicated thing. So that's my discussion about reality and the Chez Eric process. Okay, so the third part of the process, of the Chez Eric process, is making higher quality decisions, making high quality decisions. All right? And what is a high quality decision? Why do we care about it? What is happening? Well, if you make high quality decisions in your life, then by definition, you're going to have high quality results. And by definition, you will have a high quality life. And I like to think that's a good thing, right? And if you want to be a high performer, the only way to do that is that your decision making needs to be very high quality. And so we have to understand what are the qualities, I gotta figure out a better way to phrase this. What are the components of a high quality decision? So high quality decisions, it's something that I would highly recommend going into Annie Duke's work on Thinking in Bets, and I think she's making other books as well. She's very, very good at describing the decision-making process. So I'm giving her a plug. I ripped a lot of her materials to talk about this thing, but I don't want to rip all of it because it would be unfair. Go to her stuff to understand what high-quality decisions. But the way I'm going to be describing high-quality decision is that it basically has 4 major components. Okay, and if you can identify these 4 major components in every single one of your decisions, then I would say it's a high-quality decisions. So the first component is that it is based on reality. And that just makes sense because we spent the whole entire time before talking about how to create reality. And then before that, to understand reality, you have to understand yourself. So you have to understand yourself, you have to understand reality, and after you understand reality, guess what? You can make a high quality decision. So what do we mean by that? Well, you can understand what's actually going on in the world, and you can then make a high quality decision. The unfortunate part is that, can we really understand all of reality? The answer is no. The answer is that with the law of induction, with the inductive process that we're using with the scientific method, 1,000 green marbles could be a really great indicator there's more green, so you can make bet on green, but you still have 1,999,000 more to go, and you might be wrong about the other ones. You just don't know. So because of this uncertainty, the second component of the high quality decision making is you need to recognize the the risk and fully understand the full risk of what you're going to do. All right? This is a very, very difficult and challenging topic. Understanding risk. Risk can be understood in many ways. Most people look at monetary risk, but there's also, existential risk. In fact, there are 5 parts of risk. There's, biological risk, there's psychological risk, there's emotional risk, there's existential risk, there's spiritual risk, all types of risk. And not all of it can be quantified. But it's worth it to you in order to understand the risks. So for example, if you're trying to make a high quality decision about which college you should go to, right, you should really take the time to understand what are the risks in all of them and the opportunity costs in all of them. The goal is to understand all the possibilities. That's how you understand risk. You understand all the possibilities so that you can understand reality as it actually is. And that you can make then the appropriate decision on which one is the right thing to do. So when you understand risk, you can understand what you're at least going to possibly lose if you go with a particular decision. That's absolutely critically important. How do you understand risk? Well, you have to understand reality to see what the risks are. The third major component of a high quality decision is that it is a decision that moves you towards your goal. That you actually are going to move towards your goal. How do you understand your goal? Well, you got to understand yourself, right? You understand reality, and then you know what good goals are out there, and then you can actually make a decision that moves you towards your goal. All too often, we can understand reality, and we can understand the risks, but we don't realize that the activity that we're doing doesn't actually move us towards our goal. And if you want to be a higher performer with a close connection to higher power, how can you possibly perform highly if you don't do things that move you towards your goal? It should be self-obvious. And finally, the fourth thing that also should be obvious is that when you make this decision, your reward needs to be greater than the risk. And this is intuitive, but I'm saying explicitly. The reward needs to be greater than the risk. But here's the challenge though. If you miscalculate the risk, then you miscalculate the relationship of the reward to the risk. And that's where people make bad choices. And the problem though is assessing the risk as it relates to the reward. And that's where all the challenge lies. It's challenging because it's very hard to understand reality. It's challenging because the world is constantly trying to deceive us because everyone wants to take our money, because everybody worships money, or the large majority of people worship money, whether they realize it or not. And so because everyone's trying to grab all the money here and there, they're trying to shape this idea of risk and reward very differently. McDonald's says risk and reward for a Big Mac is very different from what my primary care doctor would say. So this idea, this relationship of risk and reward as based on reality, as based on pursuing your own goals, this is the heart of making a high quality decision. And if you make a lot of these decisions over and over and over again, by definition, you will live a successful life. For those of you that are astute enough, you might recognize that this is literally the trading process, the day trading process or the stock trading process. This is the process where you are able to look at a series of things and a series of stocks or a series of events in the world, and you structure it such that you have 3-to-1 risk reward, right? A 3-to-1 risk to reward ratio. So you win 3 if you win, and you lose 1 if you lose. And if you do that and you get 50-50 right, well, you make 50% on average. The expected rate of return will be 50%. Compare that to gambling. With gambling, you put your money there, and then you actually have a lower expected rate. You have a negative expected rate of return. So in your life, what you want is that you want a series of decisions that has a positive expected rate of return where your return is greater than your risk. And you want to avoid the ones with a negative expected rate of return because that's just gambling. And unfortunately, most low performers are just gambling with their life because they're just constantly doing things over and over again, allowing other people to tell them the risk reward versus you assessing it for yourself. And it's very personal. It's a very personal thing, which is why the first step was to understand yourself, and the second step was to understand reality. And you cannot have a quality decision without having the first two. And now that you have the first two, you can appropriately balance the risk versus the reward. So the next step of the Chez Eric process on helping high performers maintain a close connection to a higher power is this idea of choosing your consequences, choosing your sacrifice. You might be wondering to yourself, what's the difference between choosing your sacrifice versus making high quality decision? Isn't choosing the sacrifice the very decision you're trying to make? Why'd you split them into two different things? The reason is because when you have a series of high quality decisions, you want to collect a series of high quality decisions, and that you measure the risk and you measure the reward. What's actually happening is that the risk that you take on is powering the reward you receive based on like a battery, right? It's like a battery that's charging the reward that you want, because you cannot get a reward without some sort of risk. Small risk creates small rewards, larger risk creates larger rewards. People say you should take risks if you want to be successful. But how can you take a risk and be successful if it's not based on reality? How can you take a risk and be successful if your pool of risk-taking opportunities is not of the highest quality, if the decisions you are about to make is not of the highest quality? And when you finally figure out this list of high-quality decisions that need to be made and figure out all its risk and reward and everything, that's when you get to choose your sacrifice. And the truth is that only you can make the sacrifice that you want to make, and you have to make a sacrifice. And if you're not aware of the sacrifices you're making, it will be made for you. And we all have goals, and for every goal that you have, you need to be able to list a sacrifice. And if you don't have the sacrifice listed, then you end up sacrificing something you don't want to, or you end up sacrificing the goal. Now, how much is a good enough sacrifice? Well, it depends. Depends on the goal. However, you know that you've sacrificed enough when you've achieved your goal. What I've personally found is that all good things in life needs to be paid up front. Very rarely do we have things where you progress and get benefits over time. A lot of good things that come out of life have to get paid up front. And that's no different from achieving really great goals. So we have this idea of you have a list of high quality decisions you need to make, but then you can't do all of them because you can't sacrifice everything. So what you then have to do is that you have to choose which sacrifices you're willing to make for the goals that you want. And when you're able to do that, you choose a sacrifice and you get the goals that you want, then you can really take command of your life. Do you want that big mansion? Do you want a big house? Do you want, a nice car? Do you want to change the world? Do you want to have a relationship? You need to sacrifice time for that relationship. What do you want? Once you understand yourself, and then you understand reality, and then you have a list of high quality decisions for what you want in the world that's actually towards your goal, then you actually get to choose what happens. This is why this is the final step. This is why it's so important. But you don't actually make a choice. What you choose is you choose your sacrifice. You choose the consequences of your high quality decision. And when you choose that is where you can literally do anything you want. You can change the world. You can, like I said, literally do anything you want. But there's a little trick. We often think of ourselves as the masters of our destiny. And we often think that our work will result in good things. And that's by and large true, especially with the meritocracy. Am I saying it right? Meritorious society, right? A meritocratic society. Very true. Very true for a place that rewards you for hard work. However, what I find with a lot of these self-help and pro-entrepreneurship stuff is that they don't really tell you about the sacrifice that people have made for you. If you're fortunate enough to have had parents that sacrificed for you, then you are actually ahead of the game because you didn't make the sacrifice, they did for your future. But the opposite is true as well. If your parents didn't sacrifice for you, you are actually behind in the game and you have to make more sacrifices for the same effort. The sacrifice doesn't have to be made by you, it can actually literally be made by someone else. However, that gets really shady because suddenly you want other people to sacrifice for your purposes, for your goals. And then we get into the heart of why the capitalist system can be so crushing. Because when someone has a vision and they convince many people to sacrifice their dreams in the form of employment, to sacrifice a lot of what they want to do for a salary that might be under what they should pay for their time, then what we have is a system where a person achieves their enormous dream of patrillions of dollars. That's not a word. I'm going to make it up. Patrillions of dollars. That's beyond zillions. So now I'm going to say patrillion. Although I'm pretty sure there's a name for it, right? You can see how the reason why they were able to accomplish it wasn't just because of their own personal hard work. It was the sacrifice of all the employees, and the trade was bad because those employees didn't make a high quality decision on what they want to do with their life. Now, I'm not saying all employees are all worse off. What I'm saying is that if the currency of success is sacrifice, you can pay it all on your own. You can get a schmuck to pay it for you. You could be fortunate enough to have loved ones to pay it for you. But we have a very interesting situation now. When you look at the Chez Eric process, yeah, it's fun, get to know yourself. And then, yeah, okay, you can understand reality. Yeah, okay, have high quality decisions. And once you've done all that work, you're sitting down on your table. And now you have a menu. You have a menu of what you want to do in this world, whether it's super selfish, whether it's super ridiculous, whether it's whatever, right? And you now can choose what you want on that menu. And when you choose what you want on that menu, someone's got to make the sacrifice. And that's where it's really hard. Because as a high performer, you can make someone else make the sacrifice for you and just pay them the cash that they want to pay. Well, that's perfectly fine, right? Nothing wrong with that transaction. But as a high performer who wants to maintain a close connection to a higher power, that's where all the strange ethical issues come into play. That's where we have to ask ourselves, how do I want to treat my employees? Am I giving them a fair share? But will it then strain my ability to gain the sacrifices to get the vision across? Is the vision strong enough? Blah, blah, blah. And that's where it gets really, really challenging. And that's where we have to really think very deeply about what the larger picture is. And although I say the God part is optional, this is where everything begins to come into play. All right, that was the fourth part, and this is the final part. This is the optional part of, you choosing God, right? And so this is the part where, it's up to you whether or not what you want to go through here. You can do the other parts on your own. You can, understand yourself, understand reality, make high quality decisions, choose your sacrifice. You can do all that on your own to then dominate the world and become a high performer. But to be a high performer who maintains a close connection to a higher power, you have to choose God. And this is the part that is very controversial, very difficult, very shady. This is the part where all the fun happens if you want to be, again, a high performer who wants to maintain a close connection to a higher power. Choosing God, as you can imagine, is fundamentally a choice that requires a sacrifice. But the sad part is that the reward is just God. It's not any lofty things, and the reward is just what God wants for you. And so the question is, once you've chosen God, and you've chosen to sacrifice for God, then the theory is that you can't be half-assed about it, right? I was debating whether I'm allowed to say ass, but I'll say it. You can't be half-assed about it. You can't be halfway with it. You have to go all in. There's no halfway. There's no half heaven, right? There's no half hell. Maybe there is. That'd be cool if there was. Whatever. So you have to go all in. And that theorizes that you have to sacrifice everything. And what happens when we sacrifice everything for God? I don't know. Right? That's what you got to figure out. Okay? And that's why we have to have this relationship with this higher power through prayer. But then we have a problem. Right? What do we do? Okay? Well, how do we do this? How do we understand this higher power? Which religion do we choose? Like, am I doing it right? Am I doing what? Am I loving my neighbor? Am I choosing the right religion? And am I understanding the text correctly? Is my interpretation correctly? And it gets really, really challenging. And then people are yelling at you because you're not paying them enough. And then you have clients that are whatever. And then the world becomes very complex really fast. And it's easy to forget this idea of choosing God. Because when you say choose God, it is so vague. That's not helpful. The truth is that this particular topic deserves its own video. But I don't know if I want to make it here. I'm going to give you a little hint about it. And I want to make that video, but I want to make it only if you want it. So if you want me to make that special video on how to choose God as the final step of the Chez Eric process, let me know in the comments, and I will make it, and it'll be its own sort of thing. Because I have to talk about choosing God in the context of understanding yourself, understanding reality, making high quality decisions, and then choosing the sacrifice. And as you can imagine, I already spent the bajillions of minutes, or not hours, minutes talking about those things. To go back and talk about them in the context of God would take a bajillion more minutes and double the size of the video, which is why it deserves its own video. But I gave you the hint, if you work through steps 1 through 4, understanding yourself, understanding reality, making high quality decisions, and then making your sacrifice, choosing your sacrifice, then you can actually insert God in all those and then have your day with it. But as you can imagine, it's a very, very challenging process. I thought a lot about, what I'm trying to do with this channel. It already has a ridiculous name that very few people get correct, right? Just to repeat, it's Chez Eric, which is my home, which is French for my home. A lot of people call me Chez, thinking my last name is Eric. It's my first name, but whatever. And it makes me wonder about how all of this is going to fit. So I'm going to share with you how I use the Chez Eric process to build out this channel, and then how I'm bringing the God context into it. So in the beginning, I had to understand myself. And I began to sort of understand that I see the world in a very special way. I get this feedback all the time that I seem to see the world in a special way, and I enjoy doing it. I had to understand myself on a biological sense, a psychological sense, emotional sense, and where I'm going to grow, and how I connect with the world. And biologically, I'm a young enough guy to take risks, right? Psychologically, I'm a psychiatrist, so I think a lot about the mind. On an emotional level, I processed a lot of emotions, and I process emotions as a living and other people's emotions. In growth, this is where I'm growing. I'm trying to grow to show the world what beautiful things can happen with psychiatry and religion. And how do I connect with the world? I connect with the world by being an educator. I educate people, I suppose, in this space. I love educating, it seems, and that's how I want to connect with the world, to share with people. And the best way to educate people is through the video, because it lasts forever. I could have aliens coming in 1,000 years from now saying, "Hey, who's this Dr. Eric or Dr. Chez Eric guy?" And then say, "Oh, this is what they did," right? I could have some sort of, I guess, supposed legacy. And I'll be honest with you, like, having these 5 things, I feel pretty good. I feel like I understand myself. I'm still, of course, discovering myself every single day, but I feel like I have a very strong sense of that. With understanding reality as it relates to this channel, I had to try with the channel, I had to work with the channel, I had to poke the bear of the audience. I'm testing out different things. You might see a lot of changes in my materials. I want to see what sticks, I want to see what works, but I don't want to change who I am. I don't want to change anything about who I am. I don't want to have to bend to the will of society. I want to stand firm with who I am, of what I'm about. And I want to do it in a creative and loving way to see, if it works. So I'm testing reality to see if the world is willing to accept it. If it's not, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with just moving on and doing whatever I need to do. How will I know? Subscriber counts, view counts, chatter, I don't know. I mean, how much people are willing to pay for my services, things like that, and whether or not people are willing to pay for products I'm going to create. These are the things that I'm testing out to see if it makes sense. And, then I'm going to be making the high quality decisions, right? The high quality decisions are decisions where I'm figuring out what's the risk. What's the risk of me not taking my job and getting a permanent job? What's the risk of me doing YouTube for a certain period of time? What's the risk of me not being able to pay off my loans, right? What's the risk of all of these different things? I have to assess the risks, right, of paying for cameras and paying for, spending the time to build out scripts and things like that. What is the risk, and then what is the reward? In my view, the reward is great. The reward of creating a system where I can share the insights of psychiatry religion with you to help you with high performance and close connection with higher power. That is really, 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 it's like exponential. So does that mean I should give exponential sacrifice? No. It means that I need to give the sacrifice that I'm willing to give so that I can maintain, here's a Simon Sinek concept, an infinite game. An infinite game where I can do this perpetually for my entire life. And as long as there's a growth involved, then I'm okay with that. And if there isn't growth, that shows me it's not going to work, and I can make a higher quality decision to say that, okay, it's not going to work, or okay, it is going to work, and I can double down on things. And that every decision I make is really analyzing the risks and the rewards for the goal to help you to create a life where I'm really happy helping you figure things out, right? And it's how I'm living my life now, and it's how I've learned, with the trading process. I kind of brought trading processes into the overall life process. Finally, with choosing God, the part I'm keeping super mysterious, I personally am a religious person, and I fell into psychiatry through a series of interesting events. And in my view, that's where God wanted me. And so I love God very much, and that's been the constant in my life. Through all the difficulty in my life, I've loved God very much. And I don't know why, it's just what I do. And in this concept of loving God, understanding myself has been in the framework of God, and understanding reality has always been understanding the reality that God's trying to show me, and having the higher quality decisions has always been made towards the reward, not for myself, but for what God wants to build for this world. And find a sacrifice I make, every sacrifice I make is for God. And that's how I push myself to be a higher and higher performer with a close connection to a higher power. And I want to give that to you, and I want to do that for you. I thought very much about how I'm going to do that. And the traditional way is to create video content and then have a class and then have a funnel and then bring people in and everything. But there's a problem with that. The problem with that is it works until it doesn't work. And there's a tendency to hype, and there's a tendency to to show off more than you actually can do. And there's a race to the bottom, which I'm learning from Seth Godin's marketing strategies. I thought very deeply about what is the value I bring to your life. And when I think about that, what I realize is that the value of all of this has nothing to do with the information I give. There's this concept called an infopreneur. An infopreneur is an entrepreneur that gives information, and what they do is that they give very basic information, and then they hold back all the cool information, and they charge for it. But eventually that cool information becomes disseminated, and everyone steals it and rips it off, and then you have to create new cool information. And so you have to be at the forefront and the edge of it. And people make a lot of money being an infopreneur. But the thing is that I don't want to be an infopreneur. That's not really my goal. And I don't think it's a sustainable business model. And I don't think that's where all the value is. The truth is that I've spent the past, I don't know how long this is going to be, maybe an hour or so, talking about my Chez Eric process, the 5 parts of Chez Eric process of becoming a high performer with a close connection to a higher power. And in this process of talking about that, I'm sharing it with you, and to charge $50 for it, let's say, or $100 or $1,000, let's say, okay? It sounds weird because that's not where the value is. Because everything I said was pretty basic. Understanding yourself is pretty basic. Understanding reality is pretty basic. Making high quality decisions is pretty basic. Like seriously, every part of this process is really, really basic. It doesn't deserve $50, right? You might be saying, Dr. Eric, you're shortchanging yourself. No. Okay. I realize that most of these programs, most of these self-help programs are very poor because they're just giving you information. And the real value, the true value, is implementation. And I realize that the model I'm going to create is that I'm going to give you information for pretty much free, at least maybe low cost if I have to pay money to give it out, like making a book or something. It's going to cost money, right? But I'm going to give it out more or less for free or very low. Information will be cheap, very low. But implementation will be expensive. Theoretically, double the cost to make up for the information I gave. Because I want to help you implement. How are you going to implement the 5 parts of the process? I'm working on it. I'm working on creating, possibly, when I get enough views and stuff like that, enough subscribers, of creating a Q&A session to help you implement. But that's the idea. Me giving you this helps you understand what I'm thinking about, but it's really about implementing it. That's a challenge. But I'm telling you, implementing it is going to be very, 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 very challenging. I wish you the best of luck, but I am trying my best to create programs to help you implement. So stay tuned for them. It may come out soon, may come out really late, I don't know. But please help me out if you really enjoyed this content by subscribing and liking and sharing with other people and making me reach a point where I can reach critical mass, where I can begin to help people implement. So if you could help me do that, that would be really, really great. And if you hate this, then don't share it, and that's fine. And let me know that you hate it so I can stop doing it and just like live my life and do other things. 'Cause, this is what I'm testing. I'm testing reality to figure out, if I could really build a platform that's based on this Chez Eric psychiatry religion model as it relates to God. And now with wealth as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, I'll talk to you next time. Bye. Hey, sign up for my weekly newsletter. I send out emails every week on psychiatry and religion. I realize that email is a great way to go deep into these topics. So if you want more content, check out chesericpurl.com and subscribe over there. Thanks.